All right, today we do some pragmatics. Paul Watzlawick and colleagues, perhaps a greatest contribution to the field of communication and systems theory. So I'll begin with the quotation and we'll get into the topic. If the foot of a walking man hits a pebble, energy is transferred from the foot to the stone. The latter will be displaced and will eventually come to rest again in a position which is fully determined by such factors as the amount of energy transferred, the shape and weight of the pebble, and the nature of the surface on which it rolls. If, on the other hand, the man kicks a dog instead of the pebble, the dog may jump up and bite him. In this case, the relation between the kick and the bite is of a very different order. It is obvious that the dog takes the energy for his reaction from his own metabolism and not from the kick. What is transferred, therefore, is no longer energy, but rather information. In other words, the kick is a piece of behavior that communicates something to the dog. And to this communication, the dog reacts with another piece of communication behavior. All right. So that may sound fairly reasonable, albeit perhaps abstract. So what are we talking about today? Well, we're going to try to apply some principles derived from this book and systems theory as a whole to understand obesity, global phenomenon that obviously has huge economic costs along with the health consequences of being severely overweight. So this is not going to be a complete explanation of this phenomenon. We're going to focus on a subset, an explanation that applies to a subset of the whole. Now, before we begin, it's perhaps useful to first acknowledge some relevant variables that relate to this phenomenon. So obviously, the inclination to overindulge in when it comes to food may have existed for a lot longer than we've been able to actually exercise that desire. The last century or so, we've seen this huge rise of abundance that has allowed people to have access to cheap calories that they can overindulge in if they so choose. So obviously that is a pretty significant variable that even if the inclination was there, without this abundance, it couldn't be exercised. Now, some will say that despite, or perhaps because of, this overabundance, it has led people to become complacent and sloth-like and lazy, willing to put their health at risk for this immediate gratification. Now, perhaps that's true in some cases, although we know it doesn't affect everyone, because there are some people that remain able to regulate what goes in their mouths despite the access to these foods. So something else is going on when it comes to this obese cohort. And that's what we're going to try and figure out today. Again, at least for a subset of the overall obese population. So I'm going to reference a paper that was published many years ago now. And it was written by a group of doctors. And these doctors, they were interested in simply helping people that were severely overweight lose weight and become healthier, so they can avoid all the various health consequences that result from being severely obese. So they created this protocol, including dietary guidelines and exercise regime, etc., And he invited this cohort of people to participate in their program. So they got this cohort together. They started this regime and then tracked the progress. So initially, it seemed to be working as expected. The participants were complying with the directions of the doctors, and they were seeing results. They were losing weight. So this appeared to lend credence to the idea that if people just have the right information and some structure, that they can better regulate their diet and maintain a healthy weight. Now, that wasn't the end of the study, though. At some point, something unforeseen happened, which is that people that were part of the study started to disappear, started to drop off. And it wasn't necessarily because these people weren't making progress. They were losing weight. So this was somewhat confusing to the doctors that, okay, you ostensibly came here because you want to lose weight, you were achieving that, so why would you stop? So later on, the doctors tried to track down some of these people that had dropped off to figure out what had happened. And one of the first things they discovered is that some of these people that had made a lot of progress on the program, when they followed up with them, they realized that they put the weight back on. Some were even heavier than they were before they started. So now they were really confused. What's going on? We put you on this program, it was working. You knew it was working, so why would you deviate from it? So this is where it gets interesting. It's only when the doctors began to explore and investigate in a more holistic way how these people, the way they thought about weight and their diet and their diet's effect on their weight and image and the wider world, that they gained a greater understanding of what was really happening. So one thing we know is that when it comes to, if someone experiences a rapid weight gain, it is often preceded by a traumatic event. And this is relevant because it applied to some of the people in this study. And I'm thinking of one woman in particular that was raped as an adult. And after this occurred, that's when the rapid weight gain occurred. So how do we understand this? Why would an overindulgence in food, putting on weight, why would that relate to a traumatic event like a sexual assault? How are these related? Well, you might say or put forth the idea that, well, maybe she's upset, understandably, and has not processed what happened, and so she's using food as a means of comforting herself or managing her emotions. Okay, that's potentially plausible. We know that a lot of this unhealthy food has an effect on our mood, and it's not unlike a drug. It's not as acute as a drug, but nonetheless there's an effect, and people enjoy how they feel when they eat this kind of stuff, and they anticipate feeling good even beforehand. They look forward to it. So perhaps that's part of it. Although we could say that, food is just one of many things that serve this purpose of modifying one's mood. So why food in particular? Well, in addition to modifying one's mood, we know that food also has an effect on our appearance, right? Because of the weight gain. Now, so why is that relevant? Well, if we speak in general terms, we could perhaps say, let's just take women as an example, given that I'm citing this particular woman from the study. When it comes to women, we could say that on average, of course there's exceptions, but as a general rule, we could predict or anticipate that as a woman begins to put on weight and become heavier and heavier and become obese, as that transition begins to occur, we could expect that on average, the amount of attention or interest that particular woman could generate from the opposite sex is likely going to decrease. So why is that significant? Well, if someone's gone through a highly traumatic event like a rape, and they haven't processed it, or understood it, or gone through the emotions that are attached to that highly stressful, painful, harmful event, then they may still, or they may remain in this state of fear and anxiety and worry related to potential perceived threats, not unlike what they experienced. So they've potentially entered into a sustained period of hypervigilance, we could say, if they haven't fully processed what happened here. And if that's the case, well, what do? People obviously don't like to feel that way. Well, if, as we outlined, we can increase our weight, and that can have a corresponding effect on how people perceive us and the amount of interest they may show in us, particularly from the opposite sex, sexual interest, then that may serve as a means of reducing this perceived threat from the opposite sex. So if that's the case, well then, and if that's an effective means of potentially reducing the perceived threat level, well, what's going to happen if you then put that woman on a diet and help her start losing weight? Well, we reversed this process that we described, right? We were decreasing the perceived threat level, but if we reduce the weight and we're getting closer to a healthy weight, well, again, those around you are potentially going to notice this change. And perhaps you're going to receive compliments, and you may start to receive a greater degree of interest from the opposite sex. So we're reversing this trend. It's moving in the opposite direction. Now, again, if we haven't processed what happened to us, this may put us at risk of experiencing a potential stress response in response to this heightened interest in us. Now, if that happens, whether we're conscious of this connection or not, it may inspire in us a kind of relapse where we lean back into the adaptation of overeating. And therefore we start the process again of the weight gain and the decrease in attention or interest. So this is the real insight that the doctors grasped once they began to talk to these people. That they, formally going in to this program, they viewed obesity as a problem in need of a solution, i.e. a healthy diet and exercise regime. But what they came to understand or appreciate is that in a strange way, the obesity was actually a solution to an unidentified problem, unforeseen problem they weren't privy to at the time. So what was that? Well, that was the fear of predation. It stemmed from having not processed this traumatic event. So their, quote, solution, the diet and the exercise regime that helped reduce the weight, actually reversed or inhibited, removed the solution that the obesity was enabling. And so when the doctors took the obesity away, or they reduced it, they made it less severe, then this other issue came back that was at least being managed. Perhaps you could argue not in a sustainable way, given how dangerous it can be to be that overweight in the long run. But in the immediate term, perhaps to some of these people, it was preferable to feel more secure and less threatened, even if it was harmful to their long-term health. So everything I've been saying so far, I mentioned this woman that cited in the paper, and she's actually quoted in the paper. And everything I've been saying for the last few minutes, she managed to sum up in one sentence. It's pretty amazing how concisely she articulated this phenomenon. So what did she say? Well, she said, overweight is overlooked, and that's the way I need to be. So she got it. It's not necessarily, this phenomenon is not necessarily conscious to everyone, but she understood the connection here between the food and the weight and her appearance, and the perception of her appearance by others, and how that perception would affect their behavior. And that in a sort of strange way, becoming larger was a means of decreasing her visibility to those she perceived to be potential threats. It's really quite a remarkable adaptation. And so without this context, the doctors were really, they may have made some progress in the short run in terms of helping people lose a bit of weight, but without this additional context, any progress they made in the short run was not necessarily sustainable because of the effects that the weight loss was going to have. So is this to say that the reason we have an obesity epidemic is because people have been traumatized? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is just one of many potential explanations, and it doesn't necessarily apply to all. Perhaps applies to a subset of the overall obese population. And it's not just related to women, though. There are men that are cited in the paper as well, and they also talk about how weight influenced their lives and how it provided certain benefits that offset the costs of the health issues that come along with this excess weight. I'm actually reminded of someone from my own life who I went to school with in the same grade. And he was a tall, kind of nerdy kid, outcast. And in addition to being tall, though, he was also very overweight. And so even if the bullies wanted to harass him, they couldn't really do a whole lot because he was so large that if he was inclined to, if he was feeling threatened, he could just brute force them away. So the weight sort of insulated him, provided this additional layer of protection from these threats in the school environment. So there's many ways that this can, for lack of a better word, sort of provide a benefit to the individual. Okay, so to circle back to the quotation I began with. So this is why sometimes when we fixate on this narrow view of the individual or particular aspects of the individual trait that we want to try and fix, we miss things in the wider context that are relevant, that can help us better understand what's happening and why it exists in the first place, how it came to be. So having a more systemic view of the landscape at times can be hugely important to your success in fully comprehending and understanding a particular issue. And to reiterate, as I mentioned earlier, we know that when it comes to food, it also has an effect on our mood. And if that is relevant to a particular person, that raises other questions, such as, why is there a need to modify one's mood? What is it about their sort of sober mood without this external stimuli that is not satisfying or acceptable or even perceived to be intolerable to the person? So there are a lot of different paths here in terms of trying to understand what's happening for a specific person. But hopefully that has given you a better understanding or a wider view, more context when it comes to a particular cohort that is part of this larger phenomenon. And I can include the study if you're interested in reading it for yourself. Doctors did some great work understanding this better. And we'll leave it there. Thanks. Talk to you next time.